When an anime hits a certain level of mainstream popularity, there are a lot of pros and cons that come with that popularity. On the one hand, it exposes millions of potential new anime fans to our medium of choice, thus giving them impetus to dive in even further. On the other hand, it also exposes them to certain facets of the anime medium that they see as, in the best case scenario, kinda weird, and in the worst case, morally dubious. For example, when Dragon Ball Z first made it over to America, it was met with a lot of pushback from concerned parents who thought the excessive violence would be a bad influence on their kids. Flash forward 2 whole decades and My Hero Academia is the new rising star of the anime world, which again comes with its own set of pros and cons. Thus we come to Mineta, the new favorite punching bag of mainstream anime discussion who has been getting way more hate than he deserves. And I'm gonna tell you exactly why you need to stop ganging up on the little guy. There are 2 major complaints that are leveled against Mineta, one of which is mostly used as a justification for the first complaint, so let's knock that one out first. Along with the morally questionable elements of his character, a lot of people don't like Mineta because his quirk sucks, and as a result he will never be a good hero. I bring this up simply because it is a stupid point that only exists to support the larger complaint, even though they have no relation to each other. People would not be bringing up the efficacy of Mineta's quirk if they weren't trying to use it for a completely different argument, because there are a lot of really weird quirks in this show that, at the same time, are far less interesting than Mineta's. It has no bearing on his perverse nature, so there's no reason to bring the two up in the same conversation. That being said, the idea that Mineta's quirk sucks is also an incredibly bad take. We are constantly shown time and again that Mineta's quirk is extremely useful. He uses it to trap a bunch of villains near the end of the first season, and he even ends up beating Midnight one-on-one after she knocks out Sero. In fact, Mineta's quirk is surprisingly similar to Sero's. Both of them can create a sticky substance that they sometimes use to trap enemies, but you don't see people complaining about Sero having a bad quirk. A substance that sticks to anything except the user and binds it in place is an incredibly useful tool to have when capturing villains. And the fact that he creates it by pulling it out of his head doesn't make it any less useful. Appearances aren't always what they seem, and a quirk is only as good as the person using it. That was a huge point with Shinzo's character and the lead up to Midoriya's fight with him. If you can only judge a quirk by how flashy it is and how many buildings it brings down, then perhaps you should go back to watching Dragon Ball Super. Mineta can be a great hero, not just because his quirk is useful in theory, but because he has shown time and again that he either knows how to make it useful himself, or is effective at using his quirk on a team with a more tactically minded person directing everyone, which has been shown to be a valid strategy for professionals in this world. Mineta has the makings of a good hero just like everyone else, and his quirk is perfectly suited for the job. But again, that's just an excuse that people use to prop up the bigger reason why they don't like Mineta, the pervert stuff. If you're relatively new to anime, then A, welcome, B, I'm so sorry, why did you do this to yourself, and C, the pervert trope is certainly not a new nor uncommon one in anime. The oldest one I can recall is Old Master Roshi, and I'm sure there were plenty before him as well. But I'm not here to convince you that perverted characters are inherently funny. If you don't think it's funny, then that's fine, but to come at it with this moral outcry is just fucking absurd because you're missing the entire point of how these characters are constructed. If you pay attention, you'll notice that most of the perverted characters in anime do not get off scot-free for their perverted actions. When a character says something perverted, they are either outright ignored or derided for saying such things rather than celebrated, and when actual groping occurs, there is swift and heavy physical punishment for these actions. And it's no different with Mineta. The story is blatantly telling us that Mineta's behavior is wrong because he is punished for this behavior. Many of the characters express heavy disdain for his actions. Nobody watching Hiroaka is walking away from this thinking the story is telling us that what Mineta does is okay unless they're fucking brain dead, which makes sense considering the views of Shonen Jump itself on the matter. This might not be apparent to those who aren't super deep into anime, but Shonen Jump actually puts a surprisingly large emphasis on the morality of the works they publish. After all, they are the best-selling manga magazine in the world, thus they have a lot of mainstream appeal, as well as mainstream scrutiny. As such, there is a moral obligation amongst editors to make sure the manga they publish stick to what they see as Jump's core philosophies, which Alexander briefly touched on in his video comparing the two different anime adaptations of Hunter x Hunter. This is also a major theme that runs throughout Bakuman, a manga about writing manga by the same duo who created Death Note. There is often talk of whether a work is suitable to run in Weekly Shonen Jump not just based on whether it is good or not, but whether it aligns with Jump's values as well. Additionally, during the back half of the series, the main characters create a manga that bears a close resemblance to Death Note called Perfect Crime Party, but with a more realistic setting and concept, and thus draws more complaints from those who are afraid that their children will replicate the stunts in that manga. But I think the most interesting evidence of this moral push within Shonen Jump comes from Rurouni Kenshin, or more specifically what the author, Nobuhiro Watsuki, said in regards to the character of Hanya. Quote, "Originally, his face was to be congenitally deformed. Like the Elephant Man, the idea was for him to have been stepped on while still in his mother's body. He would have been treated not as a human being, but as a monster. He'd be a tragic figure who tells himself, 'Only in the Oniwabanshu am I able to live as a human being.' When it came to writing this up though, my editor and I got into a discussion about how it might be interpreted to mean the shape of one's life is determined by how one is born. After a conversation about whether such a message is even appropriate in a young men's magazine, I came to the conclusion that a change needed to be made. I was aware for perhaps the first time of the responsibility of writing for young people." As evidenced in the works they publish, Shonen Jump still abides by these strong moral principles. Even in something as dark as The Promised Neverland, you can see the Shonen Jump mindset manifest in folds. In particular, the plot point that Emma is trying to save everyone and not just herself. A good Jump editor is always conscious of how the work that their artists create will affect those who read it. The basics of how Mineta is written align almost perfectly with this idea. Being a horny teenager is not wrong. Being creepy about it kinda is, depending on the circumstances. Sexual assault definitely is, but Hiroaka and many other Shonen Jump manga assign the appropriate response to each of these scenarios. You might not think these kinds of scenes are funny, but to describe them as being morally reprehensible is probably the worst take you could possibly have, especially considering that the type of show you're actually describing has been staring you in the face for the past half-decade. So, let's talk about Seven Deadly Sins, and how it somehow managed to get away with this. Yes, you are seeing this correctly. Meliodas, the main character of a hugely popular shonen manga, this time one published in Weekly Shonen Magazine, suffers no repercussions for grabbing a girl's tits while she's unconscious. What makes it even worse is that this happens in the first episode. This is literally one of the first on-screen interactions between these two characters. If this had happened at some random point later in the series, then I might be able to see it as a slip-up. But having it happen right at the beginning of the story comes off as purposefully condoning this type of behavior. Meliodas gropes Elizabeth, and she just sits there completely oblivious to it. And to all the Seven Deadly Sins fans in the comments, no, I don't care about whatever backstory links these two characters. I've seen the whole first season, and there's absolutely nothing there that could justify this behavior. And said behavior is never condemned by the narrative. The closest we get to any kind of denouncement of this is Hawk saying, "Hey, you should stop that." Well, I'll be. What a strong argument against sexual assault. Pig who everyone hates. Now, in fairness to Seven Deadly Sins, this is the only instance I can definitively remember off the top of my head. I watched the first season 4 years ago, so most of it is just a blur, and I have no desire to rewatch a mediocre series to see how many times Meliodas sexually assaults someone. So if the author learned from his mistakes, then good for him. But this moment at the beginning of the series immediately soured my impression of Meliodas, as well as the series as a whole, for allowing him to do this without being punished for it. And while we're on the subject of learning from mistakes, I feel that I should again remind you that a character being a bad person does not make them a bad character. Not only because it's perfectly reasonable for bad people to exist, but also because it's important to see characters who are bad people experience emotional growth and become good people. It's how some of the greatest characters to ever come out of Shonen Jump have been written, and they are great precisely for that reason. This literally happens in Hiroaka with Endeavor, one of the most vile and horrible people in the entire series. It's what Bakugo has been doing since episode 1. To say that Mineta can never be a good hero because he is so openly perverted is probably the most sane thing I've seen in a while, and I have a whole other video on that, so check it out for more details when you're done here. Now, I'm not saying that Mineta is definitely going to grow out of his excessively perverse nature before the series ends, but I do think it is a possibility. He's definitely grown up in general from the crybaby he was in Season 1, much like Midoriya has to a lesser extreme, as evidenced by the fact that he was able to take on Midnight and save Sero all by himself during the exams. You could even argue that he's already showing signs of becoming less perverse by interacting with people who don't put up with his shit. The only actual groping occurred in Season 1, so I guess you could call current Mineta an improvement over how he started. I'm way behind on the manga, so I can't say that for sure, but that's the impression that I've gotten from this series so far because, much like many other shonen anime, it's a series about growth. I understand why there's been this big blow up over Mineta. Hiroaka is a lot of people's first anime, especially considering the genre crossover it has with the superhero boom going on in the US right now. And most people aren't used to this kind of anime humor. But that doesn't mean your initial gut reaction makes sense. If you take the time to fully understand the media you consume, then you'll see there are a lot more layers to how good stories function. And that's honestly how I feel about Mineta. Is he an amazing character? Of course not. But not even close to being as bad as he's made out to be. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourketon Joing, Christine Seibert, Tim Johnson, Call Me Catlord, Diane Versbicki, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.